we're gonna jump right into it, but thank you so much for being here for this visual poetry panel. And if you expected to learn what visual poetry is, unfortunately, we're not here to teach you anything. We're here to tell you or inform you about what poetry can be. Because this is about embracing diversity and diverse viewpoints, especially disadvantaged groups that typically aren't able to participate in creative expression because they can't write like, I don't know, Shakespeare or something like that. Not that I'm slamming Shakespeare too much here, but let's jump right into it. The first presenter we have is Corey Johnson, who is a full-time youth prevention specialist. From their bio, poetry isn't a professional activity for them, which I agree with you there. I don't feel like a professional at any point in my life, even though I'm a published visual poet. But they gather inspiration from slam poetry, and so they're building a digital journal or something like that. Well, I'll let them take the floor. Let me set up for you, Corey Johnson. You can head up here.
Hello. I'll raise the mic to the side. So, my name is Corey Johnson. Like I said on my bio, I'm not like a professional poet, and I say that just because like I'm not published. I don't take like creative writing classes. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and so in St. Louis, I didn't really have access to creative writing classes. I was from like an inner city school at first, and elementary school, and during that time they had a lot of like English classes for Hispanic speaking students, and then they just had our main classroom where we focused on math, science, and history, and then English was like quiet time and read a book. And so for me, I would just have my nose in like a Goosebumps book, or there was this book called The Adventures of Geronimo Stilton. It was like about some mouse who would solve crimes. It was one of my favorite books, and they were like pretty lengthy novels for a fourth grader, but I was pretty proud of it. And I didn't like poetry because the poetry they would have us study in school at first was really long. It was like Shakespeare type stuff, and I didn't understand it as a sixth grader. I had an inner city education is what I called it because I didn't have this in-depth knowledge. I couldn't even tell you in like 6th or 7th grade what the difference between a verb or a noun or like an adjective was. And that just felt very interesting to me. And then I moved to a PWI, like predominantly white institution for middle school, because the way that people spoke where I originally came from was not anything that seemed like informed or educated. And when I would read books, they would put together words really well. And so in my head, I constantly had like this narrative in my head going on, but I didn't write it down. I didn't know what journaling was. And so around when I was 14, I like started writing in this little red journal. And it's like still the same one, and I'm only about halfway filled in it. But my goal was that anytime I like get stressed out, I would just sit and write in it. So this is about as far as I've come. I'm still writing in it. And I don't know how many pages are in it. Couldn't tell you, but it's really fun to write in. And around the time that I bought this iPad like 2 years ago, when I had like a financial income of my own, I felt like I had the technology that would like give me access to poetry. And in high school, I read slam poetry on this team. And after middle school at the PWI, I moved back to an inner city school in Hazelwood, Missouri, which was about 10 minutes from Ferguson, where Mike Brown was unfortunately shot and killed. So we didn't have a really big creative writing program. We were really big on science and math, and our sports was really funded because we were really fit there, I guess. And so I joined a slam poetry team. We were kind of like busting around to different schools and just reading our poetry that we would write. We would meet once a month in the English classroom, and that was like the big outlet for me that I realized slam poetry was a thing. And visual poetry just kept going in my journal. but like at the slam poet meetings, no one told me what visual poetry was. No one spoke about it. And so I kind of felt like a fake poet. I didn't feel professional because I didn't have like a formal education on poetry. And so I started digitalizing my journal, and it felt like it was something I could share, at least on social media, and that's kind of what I do now. It's just on my Facebook. I publish these little poems that I write, and my goal is in the next few years to have this published into like an online digital journal. Because digital content is growing and expanding, and I feel like this would be a great thing to have. And then maybe one day get it printed into a book, but that would be something for me to decide. But the visual part of these poems is that internal narrative in my head. When I think of words, I think about them on a page, and I'm constantly thinking, like even right now I have like my words kind of going in a line on a Word document, I feel like. And in this poem, The Red String Lights, in my high school room, I'm biracial. I was raised though in a white conservative Christian household, and as a queer, non-binary person who is Black, like it's very observant of that, and I've been that since I was a child. Like I've been very feminine, and so I would sit in my room and feel very alone. And I started my journal when I was like 14, 15, and I started expressing myself. But I was very depressed all of the time because I was just in my room and I had these red Christmas lights because I didn't have the money to spend on like cute white Christmas lights, or like the neon changing ones, the LED ones. And so I wrote a poem about that because I was just constantly in my room. I'm not going to read specifically from it because I don't have a bunch of time. But like it started off very calm, but the longer I would stay in my room, I just kept thinking. And it kind of turns into like a run-on sentence towards the end. Because when I'm writing, I was writing this when I was very anxious in my room because I felt alone and kind of punished to be sitting in there. I was not like Harry Potter cast out of my family, but I just wasn't seen or heard in my family. Does that make sense? So I was writing this, and towards the end, I started writing about one of the lights goes out, and that light was kind of me because I was burnt out in my room, and I just felt like everyone around me was glowing, and I kind of started going about if one of the other lights went out and the whole wires sorted out and the lights burned so bright that the room started to burn and I was inside, and I kind of like let my hand go loose on the page, and I accidentally turned to this in my journal. And like, it just gets really messy because I have really messy handwriting. You probably can't see it, but I never like was taught about my handwriting in school. So I just kind of let it go messy because I was like, I'm anxious and I have to get this out. And so I thought it looked fun, and I started digitalizing it on my journal. And it just became this, and I kind of look at it whenever I do feel anxious because I realize life is not over, it's not the end for me. And then this one is about my childhood. Like, I think about this Saturday morning and I would hear birds chirping and looking out the window, and the sunlight looked really gold and it was just really pretty. But now when I look outside, it just looks really gray sometimes, and I get drained when the sun's not out anymore. And when the sun's not out, I still have this void. And in my head, when I'm not thinking about words, I just have like the word void in my head, or like sometimes a ringing going on about silence. And so I wanted that to be visualized in the page, because here I talk about how Sundays are good, but they're not like they used to before. I worried about being Black, and then there's a bunch of voids, and then I realized I was gay, and a bunch of voids, and I got burnt out and I felt like a failure. And then there are a bunch of voids, and I worried about myself not being human. And there was a void after that, and I just started filling it with words and actions and saying that I used to be carefree, and I know that it can't always be gold, but I know that one day it will, so I'll just try to fill the void. And at the end, I don't really allow myself any space for those voids. And then on the next slide, I have these ones in this part of my visual poetry. In my journal, a lot I write about the word you. You is like anything. Like I say in this first poem, it could be my first love, my best friends, or my parents. It's not anything specific. And the last slide, the word you just stood for the string lights that I had in my bedroom. And then it could be about my pen, because I write poems about my pen sometimes. I one time wrote a poem about a grocery list, because I like to just toss them in the trash can at Walmart and think about if someone picked them up later, would they wonder where I was going with that grocery list, why I had it and why roses were on it, and maybe why I had 2 bottles of wine because I like mine to be light and rosé and my boyfriend likes them to be dark red. And I think about, would people wonder why I existed? And that's why these poems are just about the word you, because I don't have to be specific, but maybe people will read it and wonder who you are. And so on this page, in the middle, I have a poem I wrote about stars. I keep looking at the stars and I really don't want to, because I think the stars help me and then I just kind of get poetic with it and put violent flames and supernovas, but I keep crossing out words that I don't think should be there, because over time I know this person who was you for me and you hurt me is how I felt, and so I just wanted that to be expressed on the page. I don't share my poems with people or use them as revenge, but I write them when I feel really hard emotions. And so in this last one, I had a really hard time coping with marijuana, and like I kind of let it overcome my life. To the point where I was like doing it all day and every day, and I wasn't even writing poetry anymore. That's why I feel like I'm not further in my journal, because life overcame me at one point, before I started focusing on my education and like expressing myself through this poetry. And so this poem is about, it starts off, and I have a like little TikTok video about it, but it starts off with, I'd love to welcome you into my garden. I long for your vibrance, your fragrance, and existence. Or do I just long for you? Overgrown and relentless, I know that you shouldn't be here, but I'll miss you. Wildflower. And I have that one, this is like one of the most important ones to me, just because I know that like not everything should be in your garden. It can stand for a person, it could stand for like I had a habit that I had to get rid of. And when people read this, they don't have to have you be like I had marijuana, but you can be anything that just, sometimes weeds look pretty in your garden, but you have to get rid of them to allow your fruit to grow. And my visual poetry is my fruit, and sometimes poetry hurts. I don't write happy poetry all the time because it's my emotions that I write into my little red journal. But I write about you, and you get to decide who you are. Next is Jacob Benavides.
Yes, thank you so much, Corey Johnson. Go ahead and give them all the claps that you would like to give them while I transition. I'm sorry, that was overwhelmingly good. I was listening so closely to that story there. I have so many questions for you. But the next speaker we have is Jacob Benavides, who needs no introduction. You've probably heard a lot about Jacob's poetry, but he's also a very good painter as well, and they have a presentation for us. You can take the floor.
First of all, thank everybody so much for coming out this morning. I know that I struggled to get up, and I almost wasn't here, so thank y'all. So the title I decided to give my sort of presentation today because I very much needed a sort of bottom line to begin to talk about visual poetry was the muralist, visualizing ephemera. Ephemera is a very fun word. Like, just say it, like, ephemera. I love it. It's this idea of giving the intangible something tangible, something concrete. And for me, that sort of begins to define my approach to not only poetry, but just anything that I create, paintings, prints. As you'll see later, I have some poems that are like the shapes, you're sort of playing with the margins, playing with the actual page, like, so yeah, that's sort of how I began to approach my work, and that sort of gave me a beginning approach to talking about visual poetry as I was asked to today. And The Muralist is the title of an Adrienne Rich essay, which basically explores this idea, I think, and I found it really enlightening because I read it like 2 days before this presentation. I was like, let's talk about that. All right. So the first thing I have up is a painting I did. This painting is entitled The Melting of Mars. It is I think it's like 18 by 24 painting, acrylic on canvas. And basically, I paired a poem with it. So I'm gonna go ahead and read that first poem. Chimera. If every night is an earthquake, let this body be a starved grotto. My intimate corpus is a famished state, the chasm devouring its own belly aches. Slit. Plump, dewy eyelids, yolks, runny doublespeak, sparse flares flickering across the space of a glinting cheek, and heavy is the sun that presses paper eyelids into supple petals. Methods where body contorts, smashing down into a hypnotic pool, yearning to be found. Cotton bed sheets, plastic cling to jutting limbs, beating thighs, hair, sepia ink spilt paper. Dry drafts whisper up calves along the crook of my back, crawling, creeping to my nape and into a subtle lull, attack the skin of my body both naked and nude. Dissipating ribbons of air, indigo skies once kissed and coveted, stung numb, riddled with blight, sheets drawn taut, over and over tight, my crestfallen fingers. Loading myself into bed, a bullet in the chamber of the Texas sky, blanketing stars suspended in amber. Through fog, shattering the window with delicate heat, lodging myself into an owl heart, beating, singing nothing so sweet, syncopating hoots into mechanical melodies, perched on popped flares like yellow roses scorched, Prometheus licking the sky with a generous torch. No fever breaks the initial hour. I wander, in the azure heat I ponder, and the crimson oceans I rampage, bullet ants ravishing up familiar trees. A sea of limbs, seething with eroded entropy, clawing into deciduous streams as innocent intruders, scrubbing over pewter pops and half histories, hallowed by winding interstates, veins coursing with wet ash and refinery flames. Swish. Instead of escape, freedom is falling into it. It, the vapor, alone, for all four walls are tan with fever, bubbling, wrought with bumps, bruising, dust doubling the prisms in the air, thick, malignant clouds, slip through, unfurled, curtain stealing slumber from unassuming skin, slapping flesh awakened with false burden, body simmering scarlet, plump with passion. Ferment, withered imaginations, saccharine. So sweet city, arise in me like Lazarus with the yellow veneer. Crushed between froth and a seawall that's Uranian rush, my body is rosy. I float up to Chiron's chest to rest where it's cozy. Every moon is a wafer, sitting under a silver tongue. Aquarius, a bearer, pouring wisdom into each lung, drowning aurora in silent dreams. The trapped yet vast she bellows, and the rising sun is but a cavity in her mouth. Lustrous pyres and root canals, banal drips, falling ire, drops of love to be admired. Crash. Through the ceiling, back into bed, where bodies turn violet, the room is now red. The journey in each crevice, skin, genesis to end, bodies are frigid, glazing within. And the bed has no warmth, the room is too bright, this body paralyzed, its joints wound too tight. In the night, I wake like Lazarus, to eulogize the dark, yet birthmarks on hands, tucked beneath the belly, those intimate corpus of time. So yeah, I don't know if you can tell, but sort of a lot of my work deals with my own identity and how I begin to sort of manifest that in these rather concrete spaces, to feel immaterial while being in this material world, almost queerness in a world where everything is so binary. So this next poem I just wanted to sort of illustrate how I sort of approach poetry in some method. Sometimes visual poetry to me is simply a conversation. When I first started writing this poem, it was all left aligned, margin to the left. And then I began to sort of experiment with alternate line endings. It's almost like a conversation explored in the work, where it's not necessarily the most fluid visual image, but it's beginning to push on the margins of the page. This was a poem that I wrote basically wanting to explore silence. And I think that I approached this poem, it was a matter of the cicada, you know. I think that cicadas, their sound, trying to replicate the sound of a cicada, the silence that happens in the sounds that happens in a silent space, I don't know. But yeah, cicada has I think that I really want to explore this sort of empty space of a page. And so with this poem, I began to explore not only the sensory world, but also it happening simultaneously with somebody who is doing their daily routine, doing sort of unraveling of themselves. And so I sort of work with these sort of brackets and space on a page. Yeah. So here's a quote I pulled from that Adrienne Rich essay, and it reads, "But if we hope to mend the fragmentation of poetry for life and for the sake of poetry itself, it's not enough to be awake. In Lillian Smith's words, listening only to the sound of your own heartbeat in the dark." And so in exploring visual poetry, I found it very important to explore not only this personal, this sort of interiority, but to also then reflect it outwards. How are these feelings universal? How can they be made universal? How can they create community outside of the page, outside of this seemingly, like, I know that there's like this trope that like the poet is like haunted, this poet is tragic, they're just in their room writing their poetry for nobody to see. So what if you write with the intention of it being seen, with the intention of community? So here's another piece that I have. This is an oil painting that I did, and accompanying it is a poem called "One Warm Summer Night." One warm summer night, and with the break of a bone, I felt my marrow shiver. I return here when old flames burn cold, where the ghost of a name becomes a breath from immaterial lungs. Draped across the cosmos like a plastic sheet under apple trees and strawberry growth, it's beautiful to have loved with the brevity of one warm summer night. Summer is serendipitous, overflowing with pomegranate-stained angel food, used, luscious, and syrup-filled. Pink body nights, counting every breath, overripe by sunrise, counting each death. One warm summer night, and with the silk of a bone, buried in every vein is a cadmium flick, supple honey tongues, young blood wanting to be profound, found in sherbet clouds and burnt coffee, clandestine hands, adoration unsung, arrow's fist caught between two lungs. Summer is abundant but fading, like a flare or a memory, caught between a mega church and a tar-scorched beach. Here, the enduring winter refuses to reach. One warm summer night, and with the mend of a bone, those chromatic walls glow like the skin of a peach split open, ripening a heart that remains dormant until awoken. Visual poetry is also playing with shape to me. It's sort of the painting mirroring the sort of page. The page is kind of a painting in itself, you know. It has layers. You start from the back to the forefront. It's a process that is quite visual to me, I think, to a lot of poets and authors and creators. You know, it's really hard to sort of draw a line where one ends and the other begins. This is another poem that I have been sort of workshopping and working on as I sort of try to get back into my writing practice. And it's called And for a long time, you know, I found that titles were egregious almost, like they were like afterthoughts. So with this one, I wanted to explore not even a word, but a fragment of a word. How do we blow that up? And so I found it very interesting to sort of amplify this prefix. And became this sort of exploration of not only the incomplete space of a page and enjambment, but also like how that relates to identity and self. So that's another common thread throughout my sort of poetry is, as a queer person, I'm never sort of sitting in one spot. I feel like that my identity sort of is fluid. It changes, it's constantly changing, and there's a conflict about it, there's an incompleteness that's almost relieving, it's that sparagmos almost, it's intense but beautiful. Here's another quote I pulled from that essay. This partnership of unconscious and conscious work can also happen in collectivity, subjectivity and objectivity, vision and technology, together inventing conditions for the spontaneous, imaginative life of all of us. And I feel like that perfectly sort of began to encapsulate what I hope to achieve in the end with my work, where I wish to work in community and work across the sort of span of these like human experiences. I don't know. I found that it's important to begin to look at your work as something that's not necessarily only personal. It is very personal, but it's also collective. You're tapping into something larger than yourself. And that's what I hope to achieve with my work. This was a print I did with the Rizzo graph. It's like a fancy copy machine, or like a giant like Xerox thing. It's really cool actually. If you have a chance to try one, do it. So yeah, this is a print that I made as part of a project. Queer people deserve healthcare. And even with this process, it's a matter of, there's the poetry of repetition, the poetry of image. How do we play with backgrounds and foregrounds? How do we play with design elements in a way that's not only, you know, text, but also the visual of a piece? And so, yeah. Here's my Instagram. Follow me if you want.
Poetic minds tend to kind of think somewhat similarly, and I do feel like nobody gets it unless you're a poet. Genre fluidity, and then of course from Corey and Jacob were reminded that being able to express yourself, that's empowerment, but it's also exposure for you. So this is a very safe environment to express ourselves, I hope. But thank you so much, Jacob and Corey. Next we have Xanthi Lee Vincent, whom I've known for a while. They are currently an 8th grade teacher, but if you've been in Corpus Christi for a long time and been with PBF for a long time, you also know that they're a very talented spoken word poet and like an incredibly talented painter, just like Jacob here. Xanthi?
You would think, considering that I've done this quite a few times, that I'd be used to it. Or the fact that I sit and get judged and bullied by a classroom full of 8th graders. It would get easier. But the fact of the matter is, part of poetry is vulnerability. It's something that allows us to be not just introspective with ourselves, but allow people to have a window into our lives that gives them the courage to be introspective with their own as well. Our writers and our poets, whether it be considered professional or not, I'm gonna stop touching this. whether we consider ourselves professional poets or not, what we do is honestly an act of bravery that we don't realize or we don't give ourselves enough credit for. A lot of the poetry that I've done is not even digital. A lot of what I do are moments of either sheer emotional anguish over anything that has occurred, or even if it's not done specifically to me, but I'm questioning why am I reacting to something that has happened to somebody else. And it's something that I'll write down in that moment. And then the art comes from it because I start to be, again, questioning why am I feeling what I'm feeling, why am I writing what I'm writing, and so a lot of what ends up happening is some obscure form of self-portrait that centers or accumulates around the writing, whether in front of the writing or behind the writing. One of the days that I was doing this in my own classroom during my conference period, my principal said, "We need to do this for our students." For a second, I thought she was going to get after me about what I was writing on that paper, but she seemed very understanding. I'm not gonna divulge much on the topic that was on that paper, but let's just say it could have raised an eyebrow if a parent had read it or another colleague had read it. And she said, not all of our students come to us with a grasp of the English language, but they are all poets. And you are the one that is going to bring that out of them in this campus. And we got into a conversation of what it was like to be chained down by the limits of language. And one of the poems that I had gained recognition for here at the People Poetry Festival about 4 years ago, was regarding my struggles with language. My English wasn't always proper enough, en mi español no suficiente castellano, to be considered poetry in some spaces. And here at this university and with this community, I found that it wasn't proper enough or eloquent enough, is that I wasn't in the right space and I wasn't allowing my visuals and my voice and my identity be accepted by myself. I was trying to be accepted by a particular kind of community. And a lot of students are feeling the same way right now with their struggles with dopamine addiction. Everything's very instant, very fast. Everything's visual. Everything's about the colors, the lights, the high relief of images that are on their phones. So when it comes to language, they don't know how to delicately sculpt their identity, delicately sculpt their words, let alone present it to the world, because they're feeling that they're going to be judged because who they are or who they present themselves is on a huge magnifying glass for the world to see, because they've been placed in a society where it's the norm to be under that lens, behind that camera. On Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter. And what I ended up doing was creating a space. We created a art and poetry club for all of middle school for our Compass Rose campus. And we sit there, and anything that strikes out for them that day, whether it be something funny, whether it be something devastating, angry, frustrating, they get to choose how they want to write it. I always tell them it doesn't have to rhyme, and you don't have to stick to one language. I gave them an example of something that I experienced. There was always a quote from Frida Kahlo, God, she is my idol. La mujer bella es la que lucha. And it's something I'm always saying. And one time me and my mom got into a discourse, and I was telling my students this. Si la mujer bella es la que lucha, if a beautiful woman is one who fights, watch that. Well, then I must be a gladiator of definitive proportions, and I must be a fine work of art, because I am constantly fighting every day between the different personalities in my head and trying to balance out the decisions of my heart and my head. And that's something that stood out to me. And I ended up writing it down because my mom's like, hey, mija, write that down. You should put it up on your little Instagram. And I'm like, you know what? Okay, maybe one of these days I will. And I told my students that, and that connection with somebody who is feeling so far removed from the academic standards. And there's always a time and place and atmosphere for it, but they want to feel seen. They want to feel heard, because in the space that they find themselves, they don't. They decided, you know what, okay, I'm going to choose those words that stuck out to me today, and I'm going to draw, I'm going to paint. And some of them, it's color. They paint with color. What color is emulating the words that they can't really carve out for themselves yet? For others, it is the way they choose to display the text. I really enjoyed watching the way that you guys play with space on the page, because that's something that allows even younger generations who are now just barely touching what poetry can do. They feel like space can say so much. It's the same as non-action. Non-action is action in itself, and it says so much. Silence says so much. One of the pieces that I brought was how I balance what I find to be my identity. I always found the question, what's your favorite color? Aggravating to me. It's a simple question, I get it, I understand, but I always found it very aggravating. And with poetry, I always found, well, what's your poetic style? Kind of just equally jarring, because at first I thought it was because it made me feel inadequate, because I don't know how to explain what my style is. I don't know what words to use to describe what my poetic style is. And then it dawned on me, the way I approach my words and the way I approach my art is the same way I approach what I prefer. I would always say black because it was the simplest and quickest answer. And I was always given that that's not a color. Black's not a color. The jovial optimist will say, well, black is the absence of color splendor when all light is removed. And the artsy types would say that black is the presence of all color and all its weight. My response was that black is both the absence of color and the sum of all its parts. Much like I would say that I am equally everything and nothing at all. And that's kind of touching on how we feel that the ephemeral is something we try to gravitate towards. We're so allured by it, but we also want to make it visual and concrete. Or how we feel like we're here, we exist, but at the same time we're not. And it's finding that balance that poetry gives us, and that having visual poetry gives us. We get to have more of a nice visceral experience with emotion as well as the physical sensation. I won't say much or take much more of your time because I would love to hear more of our lovely Ricardo Ruiz.
Okay, thank you so much, Xanthi, from the front lines as well, from 8th grade teaching. And now we have Ricardo Ruiz. I can help you navigate
I'd
your
appreciate
website.
that. Yeah, you know, I'm primarily a painter, or at least I was. I've been a painter, well, since I graduated with my BFA in '86. But then in 2020, the whole pandemic changed my approach. It didn't really change my studio practice because I work by myself in my studio. I don't interact with a whole lot of people, but you know, I still post work online, and I was still making sales. People were still buying art in the middle of the pandemic. Thank God, you know, because I had to go fight for that toilet paper. In any case, so even though I'm primarily a painter, I would like to go. If you could go to my COVID diary.
Yes.
I found, you know, after working in the studio all day, I come home and I started drawing. I started drawing ink drawings because I've been watching the news, and my wife works at Spahn Hospital, and I had retired from Spahn Hospital in 2017. So, I mean, I knew a lot of health professionals, a lot of people who were, you know, on the front lines dealing with the epidemic. And at one point, I read an article where when someone who was really stricken with the COVID and was at the point of almost no return, they would lay the patient on a bed, feet higher than the head, in order to drain the lungs. And then they would put tubes down the patient's throat into the lungs. And obviously your reaction is going to be to pull those tubes out. So what they do is they medically paralyze you. They would paralyze a patient. Now the patient's still conscious, so that's kind of cruel, you know, being unable to move. So they would then induce a medical coma on these patients until either they got well enough to breathe on their own or they died. So when I read that, I started thinking, well, what happens to the patient? I mean, he's still alive, he still hears, she still hears. So what kind of processes are going on? And that got me on a whole, it got me drawing an entire suite of drawings in the course of the year of 2020 and 2021 that I ended up calling my COVID diary. Could you go ahead and go down to the next one, Zoe? And these aren't actually in order, but these are all ink, pen and ink, and on Stonehenge paper. And they literally were reflections of what I was going through, what I was seeing, what I was observing on that particular day or those 2 days. This is the procession. This one's dealing with all the research that was being done worldwide, trying to find that vaccine, and the idea of there's this magic box that you can open up and there it is. There's a cure, and the race for it. And the little guy with the fez, that's God. But I use a lot of characters over and over and over again. I have since I started painting back in the 80s. You can go to the next one, Zoe. I use this Minotaur. I call him El Torito de la Copita. And it's just, he's a mix of 2 or 3 stories because I'm always hearing stories. You know, Mexicanos in particular, I mean, love to tell stories. I come from a family of, a long line of storytellers, liars, and bullshitters. I mean, and it just translates into my work. And El Torito is this fictitious character I made up to kind of counterbalance against the old stories. La Lechuza, La Llorona, El Cucuy, all those characters that our parents would tell us, all these stories they tell us to make sure that we got home before it got dark. You know, I spent the first 8 years of my life in total terror. As soon as the sun started going down, I don't care where I'm at, I'm running home. So El Torito was one of those characters, and I made up a whole story. I really should have put that on my website. But anyway, in any case, I used him as part of one of the dreams that this person's having, this patient is having. The patient becomes a frog, and he's covered in milagros, which are the little amulets that the Catholic Church provides, you know, whenever you want to pray to a certain saint to intercede for you, whenever you have an ailment, whether it's your legs or, you know, bad heart, you know, your lung problems. And I've been using that character for years since I found out back in 1988 that those little stuffed frogs you buy in Mexico at the mercado were actually frogs. Actual frogs. I had no idea. I thought they were made of glass or plastic. But no, I came home one day and my dad would never let me buy one. I came home one day, you can go to the next one. My dad came home, wouldn't let me buy one when I was a kid. But then when I became a grown-ass man, I went to Mexico with my friends, did some drinking, did some eating, you know, bought some souvenirs. I bought me a pinche frog. I get home and I'm looking at everything I got that day, and I hold up the frog and I realize there's a little stitch between its legs, and I go, what the hell is that all about? I look at its mouth and I realize there's a little stitch in its lips and little bits of sawdust are peeking out. And that's when I was hit with this epiphany that the frog was a real living thing that someone killed and turned into a souvenir. Holy shit. You know? I mean, you talk about the camera just going like this in my head. I was stunned, and it just started me on this path where I was painting this frog just as a martyr frog who stands in for the suffering. And I mean, the idea that you would take a life to make a souvenir was just incredible to me. And I did a suite of paintings dealing with a martyr frog, having visions, seeing the apocalypse, the last judgment. And I had a show at the Wilhelm Holland Gallery downtown, and this man came up to me and asked me what the idea was behind the frogs. And when I explained it to him, he goes, you know, I was a missionary in Mexico for 3 years, and I know where they make those frogs at. And I go, where? And he told me, orphanages. Little kids' fingers fit down the mouth, and they're able to pull the guts out. And then they do the shellacking, the stuffing, all that. And that just, I almost fainted. I almost passed out. I would swallow my tongue. I was just amazed at the tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy, you know, that this little frog symbolized for me. So that's where the patient becomes the frog for me. He just kind of moved the whole idea of that martyr frog, and now he's a COVID patient, and he's having these dreams. He's hearing these conversations the nurses have and the doctors have. You can go to the next one, Zoe. And he's processing it, though, as this weird dream. And there's the devil, and, you know, nothing here but a memory best forgotten, which is literally taken from a painting I did of Torito de la Copita beating up the devil, which is based on the story I made up to try to counteract the whole notion of La Lechuza and all that. And La Lechuza, in my mythology, actually becomes a guide, almost like Virgil, you know, in that Dante's poem, you know, kind of talks to the frog, mentors a frog, advises a frog. You can go to the next one. And this one's a real simple one. It's just called, Am I Waiting for Someone? It was about the same time I was working on these series of paintings of a young woman holding a snake in her hand, and she just kind of ended up in my narrative. I had this dream that I went out to the backyard in the middle of the night, and it was just the full moon, was glowing light all over the yard. And there's this young girl in a white dress, and she has a red snake. And the snake is like taking all these geometric forms. And all my pets, past and present, are just in a circle around her, just watching her do these tricks. And I woke up from the dream, it was 2 a.m. I get up and I'm just thinking about this image. And I couldn't shake it, so I started drawing it with pencil on paper. Next day, I drew in the ink, and I realized I had to paint the image. So I went and I started 2 big canvases, one of just the girl by herself with the snake, and then another one of the entire scene that I witnessed. And as I was painting it, I realized, we had just celebrated the month before my daughter's birthday. She would have been 25 had she lived. 21 had she lived. She would have been old enough to buy me a drink. And I think that was just her way of telling me that she's okay. She's not in this reality, she's not in this dimension, but she's somewhere. So, anyway. I feel like I've been here before. Every day when you're in that coma, every day is the same. And you're just this litany of activity going on that you can only react to in your mind. And there's a battle going on, obviously. You can go to the next one, Zoe. And let me know when I hit 10 minutes. Please.
You got 3 minutes.
How many? Oh, kukui. I call this one, I think, lunaphobia. And the frog is asleep down there at the base of the tree. And the Chusa is having this conversation with the kukui. And the kukui is asking her, how can he sleep at a time like this? How could you? Everybody was on edge in 2020. Everyone was just absolutely on it. And the landscapes are all South Texas because I'm a South Texas Mexican. Born and raised here. I spent most of my youth in Mathis. So the landscape you're going to see is going to be Mathis, Texas. And the trees and the bushes and all that around the lake and all that, and that dirt, and the gravel. So you can go to the next one, Tom. This was getting close to 2021. Here goes the old frogs coming out, the new frogs coming in. I was drawing all the time. I was painting during the day, but then I'd come home, and eat a little dinner, and then I'd just go to my drawing table, and every day, I ended up doing about 21 from that actually relate to the COVID series. At one point, I was posting them every day on Instagram as I finished them. And at one point, I just mentioned, I feel like I'm making illustrations for a book that doesn't exist. Go ahead and go to the next one, Zoe.
Was this when your mother was ill?
No, my mother broke her femur in December of 21, and that started a whole different suite of drawings. I got kind of caught up in the whole drawing ink on paper for years now. And really, if I could, I'd do it all the time. Well, okay, I kind of do anyway. But anyway, can you feel do you remember the evening breeze? In other words, the Chusa is trying to remind him of the life that he has, the life that he needs to go back to. In other words, wake up, get well, go home. Okay, so what was the previous one? No, go down. I'm sorry. There you go, the one with the panther. Man, people love that jaguar. After I did this drawing, I posted it on Instagram. I got 5 more commissions to draw variations of this scene with the jaguar, and I don't know why that resonated with some people, but these are the refugees because there were some disasters happening, and I think at one point the invasion of Ukraine happened, like in 22, and anyway, all these, there were these refugees, there was a border crisis as well. And so you have these people who are looking for a home again, someplace to live, And that's what I was thinking about when I did this drawing. And the little boy in the tree asleep is my oldest son when he was like 5. Because we're all looking for a home, right? Okay, so. I got a primo who, he was going crazy during the COVID year. Because he's one of those guys who everything's making him sick. He's dying of something every day. And COVID had him terrified. He didn't want to leave the house, nothing. So I had to take him fishing just so he could get some fresh air and get some sun and, and not get the scurvy. So that's basically dedicated to my primo. Okay, back to the back bays,
We're running out of time here. Do you want to wrap up?
Well, you're welcome to see the whole series and all the other drawings and paintings I have on my website. It's ricardoruiz.art. And thank you so much. I hope I didn't bore you guys too much.
All right, it's almost 12 o'clock. Miraculously, we made it on time. But honestly, each of these folks could have had an hour and even more than that. So thank you so much for being here. Hopefully you all will stick around so that we can talk, ask questions. But let's go ahead, and I think there's coffee now. But give them all another clap, please. This has been amazing. The next panel is the 12:15 panel, Spanish language
Poetry.
poetry. All right, thank you.